Welcome to Speaking Freely. It has been a year since Prime Minister Justin Trudeau issued an apology to the families of Italian Canadians who were placed in internment camps during World War II. Labeled enemy aliens by the government of the day, these proud Canadian immigrants nevertheless went on to become active participants in Canadian society. This shameful chapter of Canadian history contrasts with Canada's image as an immigrant-friendly, multicultural, and welcoming society. And it wasn't just Italians that faced this treatment. Canadians of Japanese, German, Jewish, and yes, even Canadians of Ukrainian descent were identified as enemy aliens and interred during the First and Second World Wars. Sometimes they were labeled communists, and an undercurrent of strong anti-Semitism shaped our approach to internment and treatment of immigrants during this period. As Canadians, we take pride in being part of the Allied forces that helped defeat Adolf Hitler. Yet, the tragic irony is, during the same time, as many Canadians were fighting bravely in Europe, others from the aforementioned ethnic groups were placed in internment camps or were being surveilled and placed on enemies lists during the Second World War. In fact, it may shock you to learn that when over 2,000 German Jewish refugees were allowed to enter Canada at the start of World War II, they were immediately placed in the same internment camps that were holding Nazi prisoners of war. Yes, you heard that correctly. Nazi prisoners and Jewish refugees were treated as similar threats to Canadian society at the time. 70 years later, we have to ask ourselves, how could the Canadian government have gotten away with it? Well, part of the answer can be found in a Canadian law known as the War Measures Act, which allowed the Canadian government to suspend civil liberties of certain ethnic minorities without due process on the premise that Canada was under threat. During World War I, this was applied to German Canadians and bizarrely to Ukrainians who immigrated to Canada en masse following the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, of which most present-day Ukraine is located in. But still, one has to ask, how? How could Canadian officials get away with this, even if they had the power to do so, under the War Measures Act? Alexandra Marcinkowski, who published her thesis in 2019 on the subject of Japanese internment in Canada, points a major part of the blame to our press and media. National and local papers fanned the flames of fear and reinforced the narrative of enemy aliens through uncritical and biased reporting that framed Japanese, Jews, and Italians and others of Central European descent against an idealized white Canadian identity. Marcinkowski carefully documents the rise of news articles in places like the Globe and Mail between 1940 and 1949 that reveal a clear us versus them narrative whereby Canadians of Italian and Japanese ancestry were constructed as bad and unwanted. It was against this background of national fear, stoked on by national media, that the government reinstated the War Measures Act during World War II and once again applied it to Canadian citizens. It is well established that any time the state engages in wide-scale curtailment of civil liberties, that the media plays a crucial role in the normalization of such measures. Such was the case with the initiatives around internment. Blame can be squarely placed on both local and national press at the time, which did its part to fan the flames of ethnic and racial discontent. Again, referencing another recent article, this time by retired Colonel Taylor of the Canadian Army, he says fear, whether born of war or a virus, does strange things to governments and their people. As he says, that's not an excuse for what happened, but it is a fact. Given the benefit of years of reflection, nothing good can be said of internment, but it is a part of our history, and that is the context in which it should be judged. Those who brought in these terrible measures in the midst of global turmoil thought it was the right thing to do. So it's up to us to remember and to take note and learn from the mistakes of the past as we move on toward a better future. Those are powerful words by Colonel Taylor, and something that leads us into our episode today. Join us after the break when we'll be speaking to those who have a personal story to share and one which all Canadians need to hear. Hi, we're outside of Spaducci Mercato in North York, Ontario. Today we'll be asking patrons whether they know about the history of internment camps in Canada and whether they know over 600 Italian Canadians were interred in camps in Northern Ontario, and thousands more were surveilled throughout the war. Let's find out what people know about this hidden history. Today we're asking questions about Canada's past, a little bit of the history. I don't know if you knew during World War II, Canada was fighting a war against the Axis powers. In Canada, we had citizens that were of Japanese origin, Italian origin, and German origin. And during the war, many of these people were put into camps, internment camps. The Japanese Canadian story, I think, is well known. But less well known is the Italian experience. There were over 600 Italians that were of Canadian origin that were, interred. I don't know if you knew about this history, and if you do or didn't, maybe you could just tell us a little about what you did know.
Well, about the Italians specifically, I kind of learned about it recently, actually.
Okay.
And I mean, it's something that nobody really knows.
Yeah.
Like it kind of, I guess, it really gets forgotten because, now it's like,
Yeah.
no one would ever think that, Italian people, especially where they are in the city now, how, how they've come, a long way, have actually been treated like that. But, no, I did actually recently find out about it. And it's kind of, I mean, it's sad, sad to hear about it and see all this stuff. But, it's also like, shows how strong, the Italian community is and the people for them to come so far after,
That's true.
all that to happen.
That's true. Last year, Canada announced an apology, but it was only directed to the family members and the survivors of those internment camps, not to the thousands that were affected by people having to register with the police, jobs that were taken away. Do you feel that apology was sufficient? Do you think governments have to do more to sort of repair the damage that was done, or do you have to move on?
I think you have to move on, and to be honest, I do appreciate the apology. However, it was a different time. It was a different world back then. There was paranoia, and they handled things differently back then. And it was an awful time for the Italian community. They suffered greatly. Do I think the apology was? Yes, I think it worked. I think it is enough that they acknowledged it.
Yeah.
Again, it was a different time, so things were done differently back then. There was a declaration of war. People got scared, paranoid, and they were certainly mistreated. Yeah. This is a community that is invaluable to Canadian culture, infrastructure, you name it. They've contributed greatly. Did they deserve it? No.
I think it's important to acknowledge, no matter how long, how much time passes and things like that. I'm not sure what else can be done.
Whatever is done. So, of course, the apology is a good thing.
Yeah.
But you cannot change the story.
That's true.
Okay.
That's true.
So.
Honestly, like now, I think some people would take it the wrong way and some people would take it the right way. Like for some people, I think they would say that's a little bit too late for an apology, and like an apology wouldn't really do too much to it. Yeah. But there's always ways around it, right? Like to better things and make things better even now, right?
Yeah.
I think that there's more to it than an apology, right? Like there's more to the situation to that, right?
I mean, I think exactly. I think the latter. I think that most of the time for any of these things that happen, these apologies, they often come a little too late, or they're just sort of window dressing, whether it's for a platform at a time when they're looking for support from various populations.
Yeah.
I mean, I think recognizing what occurred is important. So if it brings attention to the to what occurred, and like people like myself who might not have had as much knowledge of what was done, then I think shedding some light on that is important. But the actual apology itself, I mean, a lot of the people who probably it occurred with aren't even around anymore, right?
Yeah, yeah. What is your opinion on that?
That's a human value.
It is?
It is a human value. You apologize. You have to, humility is very, very important. You have to, you got to get down to earth and be able to apologize, recognize your mistakes, if they were not your mistakes, but the structure that were in place created that mistake, then all of us have to blame for something that happened to them. So, yes, absolutely. Apologies are
good.
Very good, very good.
I think it's really important to talk about these issues. Acknowledging these mistakes is, it's better for our future, right? Like we are teaching kids about the whole history behind us, and to avoid this same situation. I'm not sure if it's going to happen.
Right.
You see the situation in Ukraine going on now, and everybody knows about the Second Great War.
Yes.
But I think it's important to acknowledge that. That is for sure.
So you can never say never, but I think there's a lot of changes that could be made to just better the world and better how we view other people and other things. But that's like a change that has to happen over time, right? It's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah.
So that's what I would think, right?
That's a great answer. Welcome back to Speaking Freely. Today's show is about the history of internment in Canada. We're going to be speaking with two people who have both a personal and a public journey to share with you. We're going to be starting with James Malizia. James, at the time that the internment story broke, if you will, about the history of Italian Canadians who were interned during World War II, was actually working for the RCMP, the very organization that in the 1940s assumed control of many of the Italian Canadians that had immigrated here and placed them under surveillance or worse, in internment. We're also going to speak with Professor Roberto Perin, who is a professor emeritus at Glendon School of Public Policy and also the author of Enemies Within, which tells the story of internment both in Canada and in many other parts of the world. So we're going to start with you, James. You have a very interesting story to tell, and rather than me try to do justice to it, why don't you? Because I think your articles did a lot to educate Canadians like me about the story of Italian Canadians during World War II and also your own personal story.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me here today. And it's an absolute privilege to be able to speak on behalf of the many families that have been through what can only be described as extremely difficult and challenging times. There were, back during the Second World War, there were approximately 31,000 Italian Canadians who were deemed enemy aliens. Of course, at the time, you'll recall, looking back at history, that Mussolini had joined Hitler during the Second World War. And there were obviously some individuals that had fascist views that were a concern at the time, expressed concern by the government that they could potentially be a threat. And so there were subsequently about 600 families of Italian Canadians that were then identified by informants who were later deemed to be treacherous and dubious, but nonetheless identified. And 600 families were detained in internment camps, or mostly men with some women. And one of them was my grandfather, Nicola Doganieri. He was held without charge for over 3 years. And my grandfather was an activist and a journalist, helping newly arrived immigrants, lobbying for better conditions for them. So he was a bit of an outspoken individual who quite possibly could have had fascist views. I don't know. It's quite possible, but certainly was not a threat to anyone. He was certainly a thorn in some politicians, I suspect, for some politicians, but he was very outspoken and had started the first Italian newspaper in Montreal at the time. And during that period, he was arrested by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, so the RCMP, in front of his children. So my mom, who was very young at the time, was asked to get out of bed along with her siblings in the early hours of the morning so that the rooms could be searched. He was then arrested, taken away, and they were told at the time that he would come back at some point, but that had not been the case. There was clearly a well-organized effort to see him transported after being held in Montreal further on to an internment camp. And over his 3 years, he spent time in both New Brunswick and in Petawawa, Ontario internment camps. This, obviously led to the community being criminalized. You can imagine my grandfather owned a business. All the other families that owned businesses were shunned. It left the wives and the children to fend for themselves. You can imagine back then they weren't the main breadwinners, the men were. And so for every man that was locked up, there was an impact there. But that's kind of the initial start of what happened to my grandfather.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that journey, how that personal history melded with a public apology almost a year ago to the day, and how you were involved in that. I do want to point out just one kind of supreme irony, which you've pointed out in your writings, is that for a time you were head of national security for Canada, the RCMP.
Yeah, that's the irony of it all. If it would have happened during my tenure at the RCMP as the assistant commissioner responsible for national security, I would have overseen this whole operation. And so looking at it through the lens and seeing how it's unfortunate that as a country, we've had to relearn this lesson over and over again, where we sometimes confuse potential threat or a differing of views with an actual threat of national security. And this, for the most part, of course, there are individuals and exceptions in every case, but for the most part, this unfortunately was the case. And we saw it play out with the Muslim communities during the Arab Spring, and we saw it occur with the Japanese and with other communities, unfortunately, as well.
Yes. Well, that's a great segue. I'm going to bring in Professor Perin now, who's actually written about this with scholars, the history of internment, not just in Canada, but in other Commonwealth countries as well. Professor Perin, I'd like to bring you in, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit about that broader history, the context, perhaps say a few words about the War Measures Act, which made these sort of suspensions of civil liberties possible. Professor Perin?
I think we have to start with the rise of fascism in Italy. In 1922, the fascists took over the government and basically removed civil rights in the country. Anybody who was opposed to the regime was, I could say, persecuted. And slowly but surely, there was a two-pronged policy on the part of the government. One was to propagandize Italians abroad. So all the Italians outside of Italy received massive doses of propaganda in favor of Mussolini. And it was very effective propaganda, very effective. And the other was the consuls general. So the diplomatic representatives of Italy in Canada became agents of the fascist government. And so they collected information on people. So we talk about the RCMP collecting information on Italian Canadians, but the Italian government was collecting information on Italian Canadians and making it very difficult for people who want to visit their families in Italy to actually go. And and also intimidating family members in Italy. So this is not something new. I mean, we've seen it in Greece. We've seen it in other countries when dictatorships take over the government. So my point is, there were active collaborators within the Italian community working hand in glove with these diplomatic representatives. How many there were, I don't know. One would have to do detailed research into this question. But what we do know, we have correspondence, right? So the Deputy Minister of External Affairs at the time, this is before Italy entered the war in 1938 or 39. wrote that about 100 should be interned, 100.
Right.
And instead, 600 were interned.
Right.
So there was a kind of panic situation in Canada with the fall of France in 1940, which meant that the Nazis basically controlled all of continental Europe. And so the government decided, we're going to show that we're in charge here. So they arrested 600 people. So some of them were absolutely innocent, and others were fascist sympathizers. But what does it mean, really, in their everyday life? What does it mean to be a fascist sympathizer? Were they going to go and plant bombs? Were they, or would they promote propaganda? So that's the question. But so it seems to be that there are, we can't just assume that everybody who was interned was innocent.
Right. The question we'll get to, though, Professor Perin, which is well put, is even the question of whether Italian Canadian citizens were involved in some way in working with the fascist regime in Italy, did it still require a suspension of civil liberties, or whether those people should have been put on trial and the evidence shown? We're going to get into that issue after the break, and I want to hear the work and research that you and your colleagues have done. And then after that, we're going to actually speak with James's mother, who was a small child when her father was taken away, which will be a good piece of living history that I think all Canadians should hear. So we'll see you right after the break. Well, we're back with our guests talking about the history of internment in Canada, and specifically the history of Italian Canadians who were interred during World War II. Professor Perin, just before we broke at the break, you can maybe guide us or walk our audience through the War Measures Act and its history. You know, it was enacted in World War I and then again in World War II. If you could just speak to that measure, what it did, what it allowed governments to do, and what was the impact?
And let's not forget that it was also applied in 1970.
Of course.
Quebec.
Of course.
During the October crisis. So this was legislation basically that copied British legislation. So it was exactly a carbon copy of the legislation that was adopted in the British Parliament to deal with the issue of public security in wartime. And basically what it did was that it declared people enemy aliens, those who came from countries that were at war with Britain. And in the Second World War, I should mention, there were Jews who were Germans, who were of German nationality, who were interned because they were considered German.
Oh, wow.
I mean, that's unbelievable.
Yeah.
So what it basically did was it declared a number of people enemy aliens. It made the legislation retroactive. So in the First World War, Ukrainians who became naturalized after 1902 were still considered enemy aliens. And during the Second World War, Italians naturalized after 1922 could be were considered enemy aliens. So there was that. Then there was basically the suspension of civil liberties. So you could be arrested on suspicion. You didn't actually need, the government didn't need proof, tangible evidence. They could just arrest somebody on suspicion that they were disloyal to Canada. And on that basis, during the First World War, 10,000 Ukrainians were interned. And then in the Second World War, you know, we don't talk very much about the Japanese, but all the Japanese community was removed from the West Coast and basically interned, as well as Germans and Italians and a bunch of other people. So the question is it necessary to suspend civil liberties in wartime? Does the government not have enough power to deal with the problem of security? And the point was made in 1970 during a debate in the House of Commons over the War Measures Act that was adopted by Prime Minister Trudeau. And the leader of the NDP at the time, David Lewis, said, "We don't need a War Measures Act to deal with the problems in Quebec at the time." And I suspect that's true of the other cases as well. But a government that introduces these measures looks good.
Yeah, at the moment, because
Canadians approve of
a
government that acts on behalf of
the security,
their security,
and often abetted by major media outlets. They seem to come on board during these times of crises in a way that they don't during normal times.
One of the aspects of this is that there was censorship. Censorship was introduced for the first time in Canada during the First World War, and there was very little you could say about the war that wasn't, suspicious. And this was repeated during the Second World War as well. So, yeah, it's civil liberties are fragile. And we have to, especially during wartime, but it's especially difficult during wartime. I was just watching a broadcast yesterday of a sociologist who was criticizing, in some ways, the government in Ukraine. And he was vilified as pro-Putin and pro-Russian.
And that's not what he was saying,
That's the problem, that in these crisis situations, you have polarization. Within that, people take advantage of that.
Absolutely.
That situation.
I want to bring in James again, because his story, both personally and kind of in his role, is really, really germane to that point that you just made. James, do you want to say something about this issue, about War Measures Acts and what their effects are and their efficacy?
Yeah. Well, absolutely. And, the enacting of the War Measures Act to prevent saboteurs is not in question here.
Right.
The government of the day and the RCMP needed a way to protect Canada, of course, from national security threats. What is a tragedy is the way in which the government and authorities utilized it to arrest, detain, and criminalize individuals and de facto a community that had contributed already much to Canada. Of course, there are always cases where there are individuals that could cause a threat, but that has to be backed by evidence. It has to be fed by credible intelligence that could be validated. In this case, and Dr. Perin, Professor Perin referenced it, as you look back in transcripts and you have the judges of the day, the justices of the day saying, there's no evidence for the government to continue to detain these individuals. There's no crime committed. There are suspicions of potentially being fascists or sympathizers, but that on its own is not sufficient to be able to either detain or even, certainly not detain for any period of time without charge. And so it's very clear that at the time, the authorities being utilized were abused. They were utilized for purposes in which I don't believe they were intended for. And there are lessons to be learned from it. I mean, the families of the interned suffered as a result of this tragic episode of Canadian history. What's interesting, though, it never deterred them from raising us to have the utmost respect for Canadian values and the laws of the country. I'm a perfect example. My parents, my mom, who was directly impacted, and my family, losing all of their belongings at that time, going into poverty at the time, encouraged us to be part of law-abiding, to ensure that we were law-abiding, that we had good values, that we had strong values, and that we actually, hopefully one day, would join these organizations like the RCMP to be able to influence from within, and that they had wisdom beyond their years. They understood that the only way that change could occur is if their children and their grandchildren would eventually integrate and have some form of influence.
And I think it's very important because I think it was mentioned that, you know, we're titling this program "Never Say Never Again," but we're looking at these historical episodes that happened a generation ago. But I think it was you that pointed out that just, you know, in the last decade and a half, with the war on terror and the events after 9/11, the same pressures emerged. You know, in that kind of cauldron of fear, people are again ready to allow suspensions of civil liberties. And I just want you to, if you could speak briefly to that more recent time in our history.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these, and I'm so fortunate in the sense of, you know, in a sense that my family went through this, because
Right.
it allowed me as the assistant commissioner overseeing national security to be looking at things through a very different lens. And I can tell you you know, the RCMP went to great lengths to ensure that whatever was being applied, notwithstanding what, you know, you've referenced earlier of sometimes being public pressure to do something, to enact and to proceed. And sometimes, you know, there may be masses that react negatively towards certain communities during certain threats. I mean, the Arab Spring, we saw the Muslim community go through a very difficult time, where people of Muslim origin had difficulty crossing customs sometimes, or traveling because they had a similar name or something that seemed out. All that to say, I think these lessons can be relearned consistently, because we are seeing anytime there is an enhanced threat, there is a temptation to, you know, to utilize
these special powers.
Authorities. I'm very grateful that you know, the way in which the legislation, the public prosecutor's office, the RCMP, the way that they treat these cases with utmost today, with utmost attention, and ensuring that there's sufficient evidence to bring forth regarding an individual before anything is brought forward before the courts, has made a huge difference compared to what we saw back in the day.
Yeah, well, this is encouraging, and I think this is a nice place to just draw a break. And when we come back, I think we want to hear that living voice of this history. I think part of the reason, James, that we haven't slipped back into the worst aspects of those earlier experiences with the War Measures Act, for example, or legislation of its kind, is that we still have a living history, you know, a reminder of what was done. And after the break, we're going to share some of that living history. And we'll come back to Professor Perin, who can actually walk us through, too, how the War Measures Act was also extended to then look at different groups after the war ended, communists and so on. So we always have to be very careful that these as you said, the judicious use of all of these powers has to be front and center. And we can't just rely on them when the public, you know, feels scared and governments are prodded to do something. So we'll come back, listen to a living history, and talk more with our guests after the break. We're back, continuing our story of the history of internment in Canada. And now we have a very special guest, part of, I would think, the living history of internment experiences in Canada. James has been so kind as to invite his mother, Giulietta Doganieri, who was in that room the very night that her father, James's grandfather, was taken away and interred during World War II. Giulietta, I want to thank you for coming on screen today and sharing your story.
You're welcome.
And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go to that moment, which must have been so traumatic for you and your family, the day or the night that the authorities came and took away your father. Do you recall the events of that night? And if you can relate some of them to us, I think that would be very important.
Yes, I do recall. We were sleeping in the middle of the night. They came in and they looked all over the place to see if they could find something. And after they took my father, he went away. My mother didn't know where he went for at least a few weeks before she knew where they brought him. And we were 7 children at home. One was handicapped, and while he was away, sister of 3 years old, she passed away while he was arrested. And my mother had to, what happened, they came to seize all the furniture because my father they were monthly paying the furniture. So they came to seize everything. We didn't even have a stove to cook, and a neighbor passed a stove, you know. And later on, my father, as distance with the lawyer, they brought her at least 1 stove. And my mother used to go and clean a funeral parlor that was her uncle. And one of my brothers too used to go and work with her. So for food too, we're lucky enough to have the church coming to bring up some food. So, and I saw my father after later on. I had the chance to go and see him with Camille Herod, his wife, and the chauffeur, and my mother.
Yeah. And
so
Giulietta,
went there to see. Yes.
And Giulietta, how long did your father stay apart? How long was he interred? When did he come back?
3 years.
How long?
3 years.
3 years.
3 years. Yes. That's 3 years.
And I mean, how was the transition, if you can remember? Was your father able to find work upon his return, or did he still have to wait?
No, when he came back, when he came back, he was doing Javel water to go to deliver home to home to sell that. At the beginning, that's what he did. And after, he continued working, and later on, as he went on, he was working for an insurance company, but he never went back to the other thing he was doing. He lost everything. And he never said nothing when he came back. Not a word, nothing, never talked about it anymore. I think that all he wanted to do is work for his family.
Right, right. And as James so eloquently said, he raised a family of people who were very committed to Canada and the ideals and the promise of Canada.
Yeah.
I just want to draw you more contemporary times. A year ago, almost to this day, a few months apart, but a year ago, the government apologized to the families. How did you feel about that apology?
So relieved, and thinking that my father would have been proud. Would have been proud, to hear that when he was alive.
Yeah, that's nice to hear. That apology did matter to people like you.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah.
Well, that's amazing. I think, the history of internment, I think, is beginning to be more widespread, and people do understand this affected many, many Canadians of foreign descent. And I wanted to bring in the Professor Perin, whose own family too has a history related to yours. Professor Perin, do you mind if you can relate that history and also kind of walk us through what happened even after the war ended? There was a continuation of the War Measures Act, only different people were targeted, and maybe you could speak to those two issues.
Both my father and my maternal grandparents were branded enemy aliens during the Second World War. And even though my grandfather had taken out, he had become a naturalized British subject in 1937, and my father did as well, the same year. But the year, the cutoff date was 1922. So they were all considered enemy aliens, and they had to register with the RCMP. For how long, I really don't know. I would like to know that. I'd like to know how the policy actually was implemented during the war. Apart from that, you know, my parents, my grandfather was dead by the time I was born. Didn't speak about these events, and I don't think they did so out of a feeling of shame or anything like that. I think that for them it was, you know, you batten down the hatches during this period and live through it, and you turn the page.
Yeah,
and I think that that's what they basically did. My maternal uncle served in the armed forces.
Wow.
During the war.
Yeah.
And but he didn't see service overseas, so he stayed in Canada, and I guess felt a sense of loyalty to Canada because he was born in Canada. He wasn't born in Italy. So it's a very mixed situation because some of my aunts actually married men who were Canadians by birth, of Italian origin, but Canadians by birth, and others who were considered enemy aliens. So it was a checkerboard kind of situation during the war.
Now, I wonder, you know, just in closing, as we draw a close, the lessons learned from that period, and even as you mentioned too, the 1970 War Measures Act. James mentioned that, you know, when similar circumstances have arisen more recently, it seems like some of those lessons have been put into practice, notwithstanding some of the abuses with individuals. Whole groups, it seems, one hopes, would never be targeted like this again. Do you think that's fair to say, or do you think it's important to remember these living histories, or else we could fall back into those similar traps and tropes, right?
So I'm not as optimistic, actually, because I think that it's very hard to predict how people will react in times of crisis, and their better side doesn't come out in such situations.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'd like to be more optimistic. I think that, as I pointed out, I think civil liberties are a very precious thing that we need to protect, and that Canadians need to internalize the importance of civil liberties in their lives. And but when push comes to shove, you know, I mean, the governments are very good at manipulating public opinion, right? Especially during wartime. We saw this during the Iraq War. You know, babies were being, you know.
I understand. The key is we can't forget these moments because we never know when a new crisis will happen. And in that time is when we have to be most vigilant, not least. And I think the stories that James has told today, his mother, Giulietta, who bravely stood here and told us that very emotional story, I think will hopefully keep a new generation alert and on alert. And that's the best we can do, but we can do better. And I want to thank you both, actually all three of you, James, Giulietta, and Roberto, for sharing your own personal stories, but also the knowledge that you've gained from your own family histories and being part of the fabric of Canadian society, which is, I think, the good side, right? That this country has also tried to make amends. And as we heard from Giulietta, that apology last year did matter. After the break, we'll come back with a short summary of what we've heard tonight. So join us in just a few moments. So that brings our episode on internment in Canada to a close. I know for some of you, perhaps even families affected by the internment policies or similar collective traumas, this has been a lot to take in. My hope is that the voices and stories shared by our wonderful guests have helped you reflect on the nature of what it means to be a proud and free Canadian citizen. Maybe we've expanded the definition to also include an understanding of those aspects of our national story that we aren't so proud of, but which we must not forget. The hidden history of Canadian internment that has fortunately come to the surface in recent years, and for which the Canadian government has also apologized for, is a necessary story to tell. It may be that many Canadians are beginning to forget about the lived histories of those who suffered during the two world wars, or perhaps many are not even familiar with the internment programs that targeted thousands of Canadian citizens, declaring them enemy aliens. But those stories are important to recall, and the reason is simple. Because civil liberties and rights are relatively easy to protect in normal times, but it's in times of crisis when those civil liberties are most in danger of slipping away. So thank you for sharing your time with us. Remember to stay curious and compassionate, and as always, I encourage you to tune in next week when our topic will be the state and health of Canada's economy, and in particular, the rise in inflation that's sending markets and consumer budgets for a rocky ride. We look forward to seeing you again. Take care, and see you all next week.